Welcome back to our series on effective stewardship. I'm Dave Stotts. Now, in this lesson, we're going to consider our roles as stewards of some important social institutions. Now, when I say the word institution, you might have something in your mind like a big, imposing brick building or something like that. Actually, what I'm talking about is something far more personal. After all, institutions are simply ways we humans organize ourselves so that we can have a functional society. Now, the first institution we're going to consider is the oldest and most basic, the family. Early in the book of Genesis, we learn that a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. God then tells them to be fruitful and multiply. Later, Jesus says of marriage that what God has joined together, let not man separate. George Gilder has been writing and speaking about this oldest of institutions for over 30 years. He's the author of the influential 1973 book Sexual Suicide, which was revised and reissued in 1986 under the title Men and Marriage.
A family is where one learns the moral order. I mean, in your family, you learn to care for others. You learn that the lives of others are more important than your own life, even. You learn the vulnerability and precariousness of young children and their need for support and their need for a dependable father and dependable mother. And you learn to sacrifice for the future. All these lessons are learned in the family and then are extended out into the society, thus cultivate the moral order.
I think if you look at the biblical picture, it's clear that sometimes single life can be a calling. The Apostle Paul, for example, was called to be single. So I think it's clear that single people can be called to be single and still, in that state of life, fulfill God's plan for their lives. On the other hand, if you look at the biblical picture, it's very clear that the foundational institution created by God is marriage. That is a public, permanent commitment before God between one man and one woman for life. God himself is the author of marriage. While the state has the responsibility to protect and respect marriage, it does not have the authority to define it or redefine it.
Everything that's happened since has tended to confirm the central propositions of men and marriage, that marriage and family are fundamental to human civilization. Without marriage and without a family, society tends to break down, and lots of men live very short-term lives, going from one woman to another, or one body to another, and one job to another, or they prey on society rather than support society. And they lack any sense that their own lives are somehow extended into the future biologically through the lives of their children and their grandchildren.
People always ask me, why is an economist writing a book about the family? I got interested in the family because of my own family, because we had the experience of adopting a little boy from Romania, and 6 months later gave birth to a daughter of our own. So we had 2 children within 6 months. So we had like a controlled experiment in our own home of a child who was brought up normally and a child who had basically been brought up profoundly neglected in the orphanage. And it became clear to us as we dealt with our boy that just how much mothers and fathers really do for their children. When we saw that this little guy really had a hard time trusting other people, had a hard time making eye contact with people, just had a hard time with the most basic social interactions. All of that stuff had to be taught. Then you start to see and appreciate and respect what it is that moms do when they're first taking care of their brand new baby. The brain is only partially developed at birth. Now, it turns out the part of the brain that really needs further development is what is called the limbic brain, which just happens to be the part of the brain that controls your ability to be in relationship with other people. So that brain development takes place by being in relationship with your mommy. Who's doing what to you? Who's doing this for you? In your first 18 months of life, mommy's holding you, nursing you, looking at you, tickling you, playing with you, and all of this eye contact is going on, all of this interaction is going on. Baby smiles and mommy reacts. Baby cries, mommy shows up. And so what happens is that we come to see that our interactions with other people, that's the great good that keeps us alive. That our interactions and connections with other people is not something to fear, but it's something that is fundamental to who we are and something that we absolutely need. Most moms don't know when they do this that they're getting their child ready to have a conscience, that they're laying the groundwork for the child's conscience development. Most dads don't realize when they pick up the baby and bounce them on their knee, toss them up in the air, and the baby's laughing, their head's off and everything. Most dads don't realize that what they're doing is stimulating part of the central nervous system that gets the child ready for language development. Well, we had no idea this was the case, and yet it is the case. So all of these kind of natural things that parents do with their children are all constructive and productive, and you can't replace that with hired help. You can't replace it with a machine. None of that is an adequate substitute for what mothers and fathers do when they simply love and take care of their children.
Most people would readily agree, and yet modern society is attacking the institution of the family in 100 different ways. But as stewards of this institution, we need to protect it, both in our individual lives and in the broader culture.
Right now in the modern world, we treat marriage as less substantial than a contract. People violate their marriage vows with far less consequence than they would have if they violated their rental contract. It's easier to get rid of a spouse than it is to get rid of a tenured professor. That's really crazy when you think about the amount of investment that's required to bring a child from infancy to adulthood, and that marriage is the basic unit where you do that. There's no penalty, basically, for abandoning your marriage contract. When I first wrote the book, Love and Economics, I had a whole chapter in there called Why Marriage is Not a Contract. When I say it's not a contract, I mean that it's really more than a contract. A real marriage relationship is more like a partnership, where you're both in it together for the purpose of a common good, but you're not sitting there checking your notes to see, well, am I required to, I did the dishes yesterday, it's now your turn to do the dishes, and I think the laundry as well. You know, if you treat it like that, you're doomed.
Well, I think there's a sense in the culture today that if it feels good, then you should just go ahead and do it, or that happiness is the highest of values. But that type of thinking undermines the covenantal relationship of marriage. It's not that God doesn't want us to be happy, of course He does. And marriage is one of the ways in which we get that. We get true happiness by giving of ourselves in sacrificial love, and the happiness is the fruit of that self-giving love. Every marriage is going to have its ups and downs. God gives us the ability to take those things which are difficulties, and through His grace, that the man and the woman together work them out and build something that wasn't there before.
If you use the market metaphor in the family, you will think to yourself, I don't like this anymore, so I'm going to return it to the store. You know, I mean, this is the kind of mentality that you have that's perfectly appropriate if you bought something from Walmart, okay? But it's not appropriate with your spouse or your child. You need to have an idea or a sense of the fact that I'm going to be uncomfortable some of the time. There are going to be days when I'm not going to feel like being married. There are nights when I'm not going to feel like getting up in the night with a sick child. You know, but it's a necessary part of my vocation as wife and mother to do those things.
Every child has a right. This right's never articulated, but I think it's a fundamental, universal human right. Even from the moment when they're in the mother's womb, if the child could speak, this child has the right to say to the man and to the woman that brought them into existence, I need you and you together, be married, so that I can reach adulthood, reaching my potential. The more the parents take care of themselves and say, oh well, I'm fed up, time to go honey, bye-bye, I'm splitting, taking care of their own desires, they're not taking care of the child's needs. They're not taking care of the needs of the future of society. And look, survey after survey, topic after topic, if you go into it on anything, any big public policy issue, income, health, longevity, domestic violence, crime, education, tax, addictions, or anything, the place that gives you most of what you want is the intact married family. The more we're looking at the data, we can say that the strength of the country is from the intact married family that worships weekly. And the more you move away from that on both marriage and religion, the more problems you get. Kids in the inner city. Think of inner city, poor, broken families, inner city. Those kids whose mother, and generally it's the mother, it's a single parent family, who go to church every week, do as well in school as middle class kids. It's like giving them a huge income boost. It's the power of religion. It shapes people differently.
Like the family, the church is a civil institution that is vital to the strength of our culture. And like the family, the church is an institution entrusted to us by God.
There's no other institution like the church. Paul tells us that we as members of the church are members of Christ's body, and Christ is the head. So we, in some mysterious way, are part of Christ's work in the world. There's no other institution like that. And ironically, when the church is allowed to function and to prosper as it's meant to function in society, it helps the other institutions of culture. It helps the functioning of the state in maintaining the rule of law. When the church is allowed to do what it's meant to do under God's mandate, it helps the other civil institutions to function as God intends them to function. This isn't a pie-in-the-sky idea. The church enters the world, warts and all, as a human institution, and slowly seeds the culture like yeast entered into a loaf, which eventually leavens the entire loaf. That's the church in the West, and it has slowly transformed culture in the West to what we call Western civilization.
Often our culture does an excellent job teaching our kids about the evils done in the name of Christ, witch trials, burnings, religious wars between Christians. We can learn a lot from these tragic stories, but we also have a stewardship responsibility to talk about the great good the church has done since it entered human history 2,000 years ago. Our kids need to know that the church has blessed humankind in ways that the original apostles could never have imagined.
There's of course many very well-written, factually based history textbooks that you might study in high school. Nevertheless, many of the basic spiritual and theological realities that together formed the West will not be mentioned in these textbooks. That's a responsibility for each of us as parents to transmit to our children.
By and large, the American founders, almost to a man, embraced the Christian account of the world, embraced Christian morality. A few may have doubted the Trinity. A handful may have been Unitarian. Almost all of them were churchgoers and would have been framed by a Christian world and life view.
James Madison, one of the chief architects of the Constitution, recognized as a Christian that man is a fallen creature. Because man is sinful and fallen, no individual, no group can be trusted with unchecked power. So based on this fundamental understanding of human nature, Madison and the other American founders established a government in which power would be checked by countervailing power. The Bible says we're made in the very image and likeness of God. Well, if a creature has those qualities, then the dignity that attaches to him must be respected, and it's that idea of man deserving respect that is at the foundation of the idea of rights, and specifically of human rights. Rights that we have not by virtue of gifts from the state or from the king or from some powerful force of a human nature, but rather gifts from God himself.
The idea we have of human rights and dignity, of human equality, of human freedom over against the power of the state, all of these ideas are ultimately grounded in the Judeo-Christian view, and yet many people think that we need to keep religious ideas out of the public square. I think that idea is not only misguided, it's dangerous. Every institution has its natural jurisdiction. There is a God-given purpose for the institution of the state, to punish evildoers and to maintain the rule of law. The danger, however, when, say, the state moves out beyond its legitimate jurisdiction is that it will affect and subjugate the legitimate functions of these other civil institutions. There are legitimate functions and jurisdictions of the various civil institutions, of the church, of the family, of various fraternal institutions. And when we cede those responsibilities to the state, the culture as a whole loses. We should be less concerned with the overweening power of the church and more concerned with the loss of the foundation of the belief in human equality and freedom.
The idea that religion should be a purely private matter and have no role in public discourse or public deliberation of the common good is an idea that's utterly alien to the tradition of America. It's a fantasy that has been created by secularists who would like their own pseudo-religion to have the role of the governing public philosophy in our affairs. What we need is a public square in which people of all faiths and people of no faith can meet on equal terms, able to argue from their own premises and in a position to try to persuade their fellow citizens of the soundness of their arguments. If we were to lose that in our public life, if we were to in effect establish secularism as the governing religion, we would be violating our own Constitution by establishing a religion. And we would be putting in place of the civil public square in which all voices, including religious voices, are welcome, a kind of tyranny. An elite, secularized elite, is given control over public policy making, pushing the rest of the people out of the way and undermining our democratic republican form of government. Now, we really shouldn't want that. Secularists themselves shouldn't want that. It's not fair, it's not right, and it's a fraud. The separation of church and state is not the separation of religion from public life. The separation of church and state represents a separation of the institutions of the church from the institutions of the state. We don't have people in legislative offices because they're bishops. We don't have people made bishops because they're political figures. So we separate the institutions, and we're right to do that. That's very much in line with a sound Christian understanding of government. But separating the institutions of church and state doesn't mean driving religion into a merely private domain or taking it out of public life. Thank goodness, because had we been deprived of a vibrant faith in public life, we would not have had a Reverend Martin Luther King struggling against segregation and racial discrimination. We would not have had abolitionists fighting to undo the great evil of slavery. We would not have had people willing to put their lives and reputations on the line in order to fight against exploitation of women, exploitation of children in factories in the early part of the 20th century. We wouldn't have had people fighting, inspired by their faith, invoking their faith against the evils committed in the name of eugenics.
The church and the family, our schools, our colleges and universities, our professional and fraternal organizations, our missionary societies and Christian camps. We take these and other civil institutions for granted, but they serve a vital role, not only in organizing and strengthening society, but also in balancing the power of the state. Rather than ceding more and more of their work to the government, we should work to protect them, not to expand them beyond their proper spheres, but to protect their spheres and to cultivate each to do what it does best. Thanks for joining me for this fourth lesson in our stewardship curriculum. I'm Dave Stotts.